So welcome, Ramón. We are picking up where we left last time with our discussion on the Russian Revolution. We had some differences of opinion, which is good in terms of developing ideas. So let me pick up by responding to the arguments you brought forward. But let me start first to put the aim of the discussion. It's not who is right or wrong. The aim of the discussion is what can we learn from this experience in terms of how social movements look at the kind of societies they want to build. And in Marxism, the kind of society activists want to build was sketched by Marx in different dimensions. In the economic system, for example, which was based on a critique of capitalism, and where capitalism was defined with certain characteristics. One was private ownership of means of production, and private could be individual, but it could be also a group of people who own the means of production more or less in a kind of collective way, like in buying shares of a company, having shares. Then the other important aspect is the market. The market as a mechanism that determines production, distribution, and funding of goods and services in a society. And these two elements has created a system where prices of goods and services are determined by the market, where companies are in competition with each other, where you have periodic economic crisis due to overproductions, where companies go bankrupt, new companies arise, the weak go down and the strongest develop and comes victorious. You have mechanisms for transferring property rights, funding, etc. These mechanisms are in the banking system, in the stock market, in the financial markets, and in the concept of the new society of Marx, the idea was that goods and services are not produced for the market, but are produced to satisfying the needs of the people. So how do you do that if you don't use the market to determine that? Then obviously you need to have a plan. You need to have a planned economy where the plan determines what to produce, which prices, how to distribute, etc. So the planned economy is then the basis of this new socialist society. And then obviously there are other aspects. The capitalist class is defeated, so the working class through its systems of representative organs of workers and peasants, but in capitalist society, obviously the majority would be workers, and they govern the society, and they learn how to use planning as an instrument for distribution, production and distribution of goods and services. Now, so there would be one social class. The working class would be the main actor in determining how society will move forward. Culturally, the life of people would be governed basically by scientific knowledge. That would be the basis of culture. And then the political institutions that would be there would be institutions of workers' powers, where workers exert power, and any socialist society would be part of a world revolution. It's not you don't build national socialism, you build a world socialism, and all these struggle sooner or later ends up there. So that is the idea of Marx. Now, what we saw in the Soviet Union was a far cry of this idea of Marx. First of all, the economic system was, in the first year, you had war communism in Russia, where everything was indeed planned, but planned under the pressure of war. Then you get the new economic policy, where private enterprise were allowed to produce until 1929, beginning of 30s. Then you got planning, but then ruthless planning by bureaucrats, which both in the economy, in the industry, and in agriculture, where large-scale collectivization created these large farms, and the mechanisms of the capitalist economy, like price formation, overproduction, periodic economic crisis, competition, that was not there. The planning which was there was it was based on planning, but planning not with the input of the workers. It was planning organized by a bureaucracy that didn't matter about what people think. And due to that system, you get a lot of imperfections within that planning system, as you pointed out previously, where they make plans, and the plans, a lot of things don't work according to plan. But nevertheless, it was part of planning, however insufficient it was. And then in 1989, when the whole Soviet system collapsed, in fact, in 1987, before 1989 when it collapsed, there were already propositions to leave some part of the planning and provide more autonomy for the enterprises. But the whole thing didn't work out in the Soviet Union, and it fell apart. Now, whatever you will call the system, capitalism, degenerated worker state, Soviet system, whatever label you put on it, it brings forward the question of what kind of economic systems do we envision? When there's a revolution, how does this economic system look like? Here's my idea. I don't think you can have one formula for every country. You can't have the same system for China and the same system for Cuba, the same system for Bolivia or Venezuela or Iran or whatever. So that's the first thing. So you need to take into account what is the historical conditions of a country, and then determine what kind of economic system can be put in place that works in favor of the majority of the population. And here is, I think, one of the problems of the Marxist economic theory is that the concept of surplus value is based on the idea that the value is produced by workers. Because the capitalist has the ownership of the means of production, and because there's this market mechanism where the worker has to sell its labor power, that condition creates the fact that there is exploitation, because part of what the workers produce goes to the capitalists, and within the Marxist theory, that is exploitation. Now, there are other economic theories where profit is not necessarily seen by definition as exploitation. Profit can also be seen within context as reasonable profit, as a remuneration for enterprise, so for entrepreneurship. So profit is not by definition exploitation. This is in an Islamic economic theory, in Buddhist economic theory, but also in liberal economic theory, where all profit is seen as a compensation for entrepreneurship. While, let's say, in Buddhist or economic theory, there is a moral dimension of it. It is limited. It's not. You can't have unlimited profit, because then it becomes greed and it is morally of a different nature. Now, if you think that by definition entrepreneurship is exploitation, then obviously sooner or later the kind of economy you will build should do away with private ownership of means of production. Sooner or later that should be the case, because by definition it is exploitation. If you don't see it like that, which would be a big breach in Marxist economic theory, and you would argue that yes, profit can be seen within a moral limitation as a reward for entrepreneurship, then it is possible to build an economic system where the market is subjugated by the state. It doesn't rule the state. The state uses market and entrepreneurship to develop the economic potential of a country, and therefore by taking the creativity of entrepreneurship and use that to develop an economy. And I think the lesson of the Russian Revolution is basically that the role of the state in setting up a planning system that just couldn't manage the economy basically was at the root of the crisis that led to the downfall of the Soviet system. Now it's very interesting to see how other countries, China, Vietnam, Cuba now is thinking about it, Bolivia, Venezuela. How do they view Iran, although it's not a socialist revolution, it's an Islamic revolution, but an anti-imperialist one? How do they view the economic system that can generate welfare to lift people out of poverty, to give them a better life, and on the basis of that economic system develop social, political, cultural liberation? I think the Soviet obviously failed in that respect, and it should be interesting to evaluate, you know, the experience of other revolutions, which we should do in the coming sessions. So that's where I stand in the evaluation of the Soviet system.
Okay, I agree that, you know, we have discrepancies on the characterization. And I think the most important thing to look at is at the lessons and at what happened, because I think it's an important experience if we think about the transformation, social transformation into the 21st century, into the future. I don't think we should leave behind the 20th century socialism experience. Leave it behind and not look at it. We need to learn from the problems of those revolutions and those processes. I mean, there were a lot of problems that led to their failure, and we need to take the lessons from there to move forward, So I agree that that should be our focus. I think that, in terms of what you described, this periodization, I agree with you that up till 1930, 1929, 1930, between 1917, 1929, there was a mixed economy. It was state capitalism, I know you don't call it that way, and private capitalism. So they coexisted, over a period of, 13, 14 years, until finally Stalin followed the program of Trotsky. And Trotsky would have done what Stalin did probably earlier than him, and collectivized everything by force and eliminated everything, all private enterprises in the country. Trotsky would have done it probably 10 years before than him. And so that's why, for me, the difference between Stalin and Trotsky is really a problematic dualism, because they share the paradigm, and Stalin eliminated did what Trotsky was calling for 10 years before. He eliminated private enterprises. He eliminated small businesses. He's eliminated the peasant, ownership to a small plot of land and all of that. And then did a collectivization, nationalization of everything by force, okay? Where they went with for example, in the countryside, they went with the army and forced people to, and there were a lot of people who were killed, and a lot of people who died of famine and stuff like that, because they just took over everything and put it into collective farms, controlled by the state, fundamentally controlled by the state. I call that monopoly capitalism. The fact that there's no competition in a country doesn't mean capitalism is not there. It's just monopoly capitalism. It's a state monopoly capitalist society. That's what they built. And it was controlled by a state bourgeois bureaucratic class, that were the ones who control the means of production. Even though in legal papers, they have no private ownership. But as I explained in the previous discussion, the concept of private ownership or private property in Marx is not a legal term. It's a social relational term. And you can have the private property without necessarily having a legal code saying that enterprise belongs to you, because it was legally belonged to the state, but the state had a class there, a bourgeois bureaucratic class that were controlling the means of production in a monopolic way in the country. And how the capitalist system operated there? Well, they were selling a lot of the production to the international market for a profit. And that profit is called surplus value. So the market mechanism was there, the private ownership of the means of production was there, the wage labor was there, and the monopoly capitalist character of the economy was there. So for me, that's, I know you disagree, and let's agree to disagree, but for me, that's a state capitalist society. But anyway, and I think that the wealth of these bureaucrats, were not coming from the air. They were coming from the appropriation of surplus value. That's why the top capitalist bureaucrats, they have dachas, their vacation mansions. They have mansions where they live the whole year. Then they have the vacation mansions. They have, servants. They have chauffeurs. They have everything you can imagine that any capitalist in the world have, you know? So they have a living that was completely, of course, it was different because the authoritarian character of the state there, your survival as a capitalist depended on your relationship with Stalin, you know? You will be part of that bureaucratic capitalist class and enjoy the appropriation of surplus value as long as you did everything Stalin ordered, okay? If at some point you enter in disgrace, you were not only kicked out of the top capitalist class, you were, you know, the bureaucratic capitalist class, you were in a sense either shoot, you know, kill, or sent to the slave labor camps, you know, which by the way, we need to I have to say this, the industrialization of the Soviet Union was based on slave labor. We have to, like the British, like the French, like European industrialization in the 19th century, it was based on slave labor. They did the same thing. The difference is that instead of having colonies in the Caribbean enslaving people like they did, or in North America, you know, like the British and the French and the Dutch and everybody else, they have their own slaves inside the country. That is, these are the KGB concentration camps or labor camps that were forced. It was a forced labor, and anybody who was in disgrace, they were sent there. And a lot of people died because they were put to do the jobs that were very risky to your health. So a lot of people die in those concentration camps, you know, not, you know, labor camps. And they were forced to work to build precisely at a fast rate the industrialization of the country. This is important to say because this state, monopoly capitalist state, they also have slave labor at their disposition to be able to do what they did. A lot of the leftists, they applaud this major achievement. Wow, so, you know, industrialized in 10 years, 15 years, right? But they don't see the moral consequences or what was the condition of possibility for this fast industrialization, okay? And the condition of possibility was, you know, what's the name of those labor camps? The
Gulags.
The gulags, thank you. The gulags, it was the gulags, you know, and the gulags was a form, it was slave labor, literally slave labor, people working 20 hours a day until they were so exhausted that they die right there, and they bring more people, you know, that were enslaved in this system. And they were doing the railroad system, they were doing bridges, they did the metro system, in the subway system in Moscow. They did all kind of work across the country that were the infrastructure for the industrialization of the country. So for me, this is just a continuation of capitalism of a different form, because it's a state capitalism. And so it has a different particularities that is different from the classical capitalism of the West, but it's nevertheless, I still call it state capitalism. But anyway, so there are works on this that are very interesting to read. I will recommend to read C.L.R. James, the Black Marxists from the Caribbean, Tony Cliff. These two were from the Trotskyist tradition, but they broke with Trotsky on these questions because Trotsky still characterized the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state that is still socialist, even though the workers have no power. You know, so it was a contradiction, that analysis. How could you say that it's socialist if the workers have no power? You know, it's controlled by someone else. But anyway, and from other traditions, like I highly recommend the work of Charles Bettelheim. Is a French Marxist economist who spent, like, I don't know how many years in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. He also went to China in the 60s. He was a guy who knew very profoundly the Soviet Union, and he wrote a book on the experience of China too. And so he became very sympathetic of the socialist struggles of the global South against this model of Stalinism. And he will do the same critique to Trotsky. You know, it's not just Stalin. Trotsky-Stalin binary is very problematic, but they have the same program. But anyway, and so he wrote 3 volumes that are very important. It's called Class Struggle in the Soviet Union. The first volume was published by Monthly Review Press in New York, and it's 1917-1923. The second volume was also published by Monthly Review Press in New York, and it's 1924-1930. Then the third volume, Monthly Review Press, which are leftist Marxists from New York, they never publish it. The third volume is split in 2 volumes, the third volume. It goes 1930-1940. And the first volume is called The Dominant Class, and the second volume is called The Dominated Classes. And there he put forward a very profound analysis about the state capitalist character of the Soviet Union, how it works and everything. You know, he has written already several books on 1930 Soviet Union economy. So the guy knew this thing back and forth. But then he concludes in this third volume that was never published by Monthly Review Press. And I think they never published it because it throws down everything about the Soviet Union, because in this third volume, he's saying that that there was never, it was always capitalist. The Soviet Union never managed to do a transition beyond capitalism. And he goes over that the whole period of the 1930s as the end result of all those years. He even say that the October Revolution was a putsch. It was not really a mass revolution. It was a putsch. He says a small group of people in the cities took over and then imposed this in the rest of the country. You know, so he even said that he's questioning even the mass character of the October Revolution or the mass support. He said the majority of the country did not have, did not participate, did not, you know, it just happened inside 1 or 2 cities, and and then they spread the whole thing to the rest of the country, and that's why he said that they entered in a lot of trouble because they didn't have the support of the peasants of the rest of the country in an agrarian society such as Russia. So he's questioning even the idea that there was such a thing as a proletarian power, okay? Because very early in the revolution, as you know, the Soviets were dismantled by the Bolshevik Party and and also by the Civil War that destroyed the structures of the Soviets and all of that. That was never restored or reorganized after the Civil War. So I recommend to read that. The third volume is all in French. Okay, this was published in French. The guy is a French economist, Marxist economist, and but it was translated to English, the first 2 volumes, and the third volume was translated in India. In India, a small publisher in India translated it and published it, but it's very difficult to get a copy of it because it's completely sold out. I mean, years ago it was sold out, and nobody have reprinted that, and it's a very, very important work that have never been. For example, in Spanish language, we have volume 1, volume 2, but we don't have this 1930s work. We don't have it in Spanish either, because it's happened the same thing. The publisher, leftists, they like the volume 1, volume 2, but when they saw his analysis of the 1930s, they back off from it, you know, because he was questioning all the mythology about the October Revolution in a radical way. And so they didn't publish it, you know, so we don't have access in Spanish language to that third volume. And that third volume in French is published in 2 separate volumes, even though the 2 are called third volume that work, okay? And it's as I said, the dominant class and the subordinate class. The dominant class is the bourgeois the capitalist state bureaucratic class, and the dominated classes are the working classes. And he shows there the class struggle and the exploitation of labor and all of that was happening. And that's why he's, then he does in that volume, he kind of revised some of the things he said, volume 1 and volume 2. That's why the people who publish the first 2 volumes, who usually are leftists, they don't want to publish the third one. So, okay. Let's talk about what you were saying. Let me say the first thing I want to say is that in war historians, as well as some Marxists like War System School of Thought, they always acknowledge that, and even in Marx, that you could see that in Marx, not in the Marxists, but in Marx, that markets in themselves is not a bad thing, okay? Markets are, have been there from the, origins of humanity. It's been markets there. In many civilizations, there's been markets, and markets are not necessarily capitalists, because there's been markets before capitalism exists, okay? And so you could have markets without capitalism. And that has been like that. It's been like that in previous civilizations, okay? What capitalism does is to use the mechanism of markets to basically appropriate wealth or appropriate surplus value through market mechanisms. In the past, in previous civilization, there were either state structure or communal forms of political authority that will put restrictions to the entrepreneurs that will accumulate too much wealth. So there was a limit of how much wealth you can get. So if you look at world system theories, and people who have studied world system theories, who have studied previous civilizations, even Wallenstein himself, they recognized that there were capitalists under the Roman Empire, even though the Roman Empire was not capitalist. There were capitalists also in India, under a different world system, social system. And in many parts of the world, they were in China. There were, capitalists in the classical sense, someone who hires labor, pay a wage, and sell in a market for a profit, whatever they produce. The reason there was no capitalism in Muslims is the same in Muslim civilization, okay? In Chinese civilization, in the Roman civilization, Roman Empire civilization, in Chinese civilization, the reason you cannot call those systems capitalist is because the overall system was not working along capitalist logic. There were capitalists that operated within those systems, but they have no power, okay? The power was either in the community or in the state. And both put, whatever, depending on which civilization you're dealing with, they were putting limits in terms of how far they can grow. They will not allow the capitalists to take over the economy or to take over the logic of the economy, okay? So this is very important to know, because there's work done by many historians showing this, that there were literally people that we would call today capitalists, but in those civilizations, but they were not operating under the control of capitalists or in a capitalist system. They were under another system that put limits. That's why the capitalists always hated state structures, because state structures, the private capitalists, I mean, state structure will put some taxation under a different social system, and those taxation will make them, were very high, so that they could not flourish in a crazy way that will put imbalances or huge inequalities in those civilizations. You see, so this is important to say. There were also small entrepreneurs. Small entrepreneurs not a capitalist. Okay, they're not exploiting labor, or they have labor. They're not, they're not getting most of their wealth from labor. They themselves work, or they themselves are part of the labor, or that kind of thing. So it's very. Even the Marxists acknowledge the difference between a petit bourgeois and a bourgeois. So you cannot collapse anybody who has a small private property, a small entrepreneur, into the concept of capitalist. You see, they might aspire to become capital, but the majority of them will never get there. Okay, because capitalism, and this is a very important discussion with you, because now what I'm saying now is based on the world historical analysis of world system theoreticians, such as Fernand Braudel, such as Oliver Cox, the guy from Trinidad, the Black Marxist from Trinidad, Giovanni Arrighi, Immanuel Wallerstein. I should say in the correct order. The Black Marxists first, Oliver Cox, who influenced these three guys, okay? The Trinidad Black Marxists from the Caribbean influenced over Braudel and over Arrighi, and then Braudel influenced Arrighi and Wallerstein, okay? Then Arrighi and Wallerstein knew that these ideas of Braudel were coming from Oliver Cox. And one of the things is, what is capitalism? If you look at Lenin, when he talks about, if you look at Marx, Marx is talking always about a competitive capital. He's not talking about, in his Das Kapital, you could see that he's considering their competition among capitalists. So for him, one inherent characteristic of capitalism is this competition, right? And then Lenin comes and say, hey, you are at a stage of what he called imperialism, high stage of capitalism, because now we are at a stage of monopoly capitalism, where the financial capitalist, which is the fusion of the banks and the industries, okay? Financial capital has the upper hand. They are the one in control. Financial capital in control of what? In control of monopoly capitalism, monopoly markets. And this monopolization markets is what creates the wars. This is what he said. And I will say he's correct in one sense, in the sense that when he was, what Marx was studying, right? He said we're now after 1870 into a global imperialist system with financial capital having the upper hand. And this is not competitive capitalism, this is monopoly capitalism. And what we're seeing now is the highest stage of capitalism he called imperialism. Guess what? If you change the geography of reason, by the way, I've written about this in Spanish language. Unfortunately, I don't have it in English, but I have criticized Lenin on this because if you look at world history and you look, for example, the work of Oliver Cox, Braudel, Wallerstein, Arrighi, you could see that capitalism, and this is a point Braudel insists, he said capitalism is always defined in terms of financial capital. That is, financial capital was a monopoly capitalist. It was always from the beginning there. If you cheat the geography of reason, that is, instead of looking at Europe and the competition between European empires and things like this, okay, which is what happened to Lenin. Lenin is in Russia looking at the internal competition between all these imperialist countries in Europe, which led to war. You know, he was correct on that. But if you look at it from the global south, capitalism was always monopolic, was always financial capital having the lead, okay, and having the leadership or the control over the system. And so what defines capitalism is precisely the characterization that makes that is made by Lenin, there about financial, monopoly capitalism and financial capital having control over other forms of capitalism. Okay, and that's there from the beginning. That's there from the early period. If you read, for example, the long 20th century of Giovanni Righi, it shows you very clearly that financial capital was the leading capitalist in world capitalism from the early period. Okay, from the 15th, 16th century. Okay, and you can see that also in Oliver Cox. You could see that in and what were they doing in this colony? They were monopolizing markets. They were monopolizing market, and the whole inter-imperialist competition was about monopolizing world markets. So Braudel, for example, makes a very strong point saying, wherever you have competition, you don't have capitalism. When you have the attempt at monopolizing markets and financial capital coming in, speculating and leading the investments into these projects, that's capitalism. That's when you have capitalism. To disentangle, precisely, he does that to disentangle the idea that you are also implying in what you're saying about other civilizations, the idea that if you have someone who has an entrepreneur, making money or hiring people, that in itself is capitalism. He's saying, brothers say, this form of what the Marxists call competitive capitalism, that's not capitalism. That's a complete distortion, because that form existed in many civilizations in the past and they were not capitalists. Okay, that form is capitalism from its origin in the European colonial expansion was always led by financial capitalists. For example, in the expansion to America, it was the Genoese financial capital, okay, that were financing the expansion to the Americas of the Spanish Empire. This is said by Oliver Cox. This is said, then repeated by Braudel and by the others, okay? But Oliver Cox was the first one to look at this, And if you look then at the hegemonic transition in the 17th century, when the Spaniards are displaced with the Genoese pass their wealth to the Dutch and transfer the wealth from the expoliation and plundering of the Americas to the Dutch banks, and then the Dutch take over after the 30-year war, with Spain displacing the Spanish Empire, and then the Dutch took over, okay, with a lot of the resources of financial capital coming from Genoese financial capital, okay? And then you have the same transition happening in the 19th century, where the Dutch transfer a lot of the wealth to the British, and the British end up being the hegemonic, takeover from the Dutch after the Napoleonic Wars, when the British beat up the French in 1814, the Battle of 1814. And then later you have the USA and British passing financial capital to USA. So in the hegemonic transitions of 700 years of capitalism, you can see there financial capital as becoming the leading point. And you can see from the beginning, the whole competition of world capitalism was about monopolizing markets. And that's why they ended up in wars, because they wanted to monopolize for themselves the markets. And in each colony they colonize, they have monopoly capitalism, because they did not allow the colonized people to have free market or to trade with other countries, anything like this, okay? Everything was controlled by the imperial country. And so they were forced to buy from the imperial countries, they were forced to sell to the imperial country, and they were forced to work for the imperial country for nothing, So what Braudel, Cox, Wallenstein, and Righi are putting on the table is a redefinition of the concept of capitalism that is friendly to what you just were saying, because they are saying that it's wrong to think about capitalism in this old-fashioned way, because what Marx was doing, Marx was theorizing capitalism in Europe, okay, in the industrial capitalist stage. But capitalism was there way before the Europeans were doing industrial capitalism. And what happened is he was trying to do an abstract reconstruction to understand the logics of capitalism. He was not dealing with historical capitalism. In any case, he was dealing with the British study of the British capitalism. And from there, a lot of the Marxist 20th century start deriving conclusions that were completely wrong, because Marx, in a sense, was looking in a limited way to, his work was very influential and very important. I'm not denying his contributions in terms of showing the exploitation of labor, all this stuff, but it was limited because it was, in a sense, thought in terms of wage labor and industrial capitalism as capitalism. He lost sight of agrarian capitalism, commercial capitalism, financial capitalism, although in his unpublished manuscripts, he's there, okay? And this has been discovered lately by someone like Enrique Dussel and other people, that there's a lot more to Marx than what we're reading in what was published, because there were a lot of, he revised his 3 volumes of Capital, I don't know how many times, and there are like 5 times. And the latest versions are more consonant or coherent to what we live today, with financial capitalism, being the lead, and globalization, all this stuff is already there in his latest volume of Capital, but they were never published. They're now being published in German lately, and they haven't been translated yet. Okay, so remember, there was 100-something volumes of Marx of the last 20 years of his life, where he kept revising the manuscripts of Capital, okay? But they were never published, and Engels never had access to them. Never have access. Engels reconstruct the 2nd and 3rd volume with the 2nd or 3rd manuscript of Marx of that Capital. He never have access to the 4th, 5th manuscript. And these are late discoveries. So I would say, like Dussel says, there's a difference between Marx and the Marxists, okay? Marx was a much more, and he even started criticizing his own Eurocentrism at the end of his life, and he started talking about, in his relationship, he learned Russian language himself, to enter in conversation and to read and to write letters and read the letters, enter in letter communication with the Russian populists of the 19th century, who were questioning a lot of the narrative of Marx at the time, who thought that the development of economy was through stages of modes of production. He say there that it's not that way, and he begins to question his own Eurocentrism when the Russian populists say, hey, we don't need to pass through capitalism to get to a communist society. We can do it through the Russian commune, and then suddenly he opens his eyes to this and he starts learning Russian, and he then begins to communicate with them. And Enrique Dussel, who have read the whole published and unpublished manuscripts of Marx, I read the whole thing. He told me an anecdote, which is that he found the parts where Marx was learning Russian, and the notes and everything, where he's learning Russian to be able to communicate with these people, and to read them, So he was reading them. And there's a lot of letters back and forth that haven't been published between him and them. There is one in particular where some Russian over there, popular Russian, they say, we want to reprint, we want to translate the 1st volume of Capital, which is the only one that was published during his life, and Marx replies saying, that's not worthy for you. That's only relevant to Western Europe. It doesn't make sense to translate that over there because it's irrelevant for Russia. He was already questioning his Eurocentrism, questioning seeing how his work was centered in Western European experience and had nothing to do with what happened elsewhere, And he began to, he was breaking away from this Eurocentric thinking to think that local European history is world history. You see, the words of Eurocentrism. No, he was already breaking with that. And this is anecdote that Enrique Dussel have told me, that things he have read there, in the archives, and he has published about this. But Enrique Dussel have 5 volumes of Marx, but all in Spanish. I think it's only one of the 5 volumes that have been translated to English of Enrique Dussel on this question. And the English one is Towards an Unknown Marx. Look at that title, okay? That's the only one he has been able to publish. There are 4 other volumes that he wrote on this, that fortunately we have access to it in Spanish, because this is the only guy who have read the published and unpublished manuscript of Marx. And not only that, since he's decolonial, he's able to see things that many people cannot see, you know? So he could see the decolonial changes in Marx himself. So I'm saying this because we need to also question the concept of capitalism we have on our heads, because by using competitive capitalism as a definition of capitalism is very problematic, because as you well said, in previous civilization, there were markets, there were entrepreneurs, there were all this stuff, you know, and that doesn't make, even individual capitalists, you know, but that doesn't make it capitalist system, you know. So what is it that happened with the formation of world capitalism in the European colonial expansion in the 15th, 16th century? What is it that happened there? Well, that is different from the previous capitalist enterprises of the past. One thing, monopolization of markets and financial capital taking the lead, you know, and now super exploiting the rest of the world, you know, and without any control by anybody, because this is where in the past, the individual capital have some were controlled by community, political authority, or by state. But now, with the splitting of different states in the world, you know, they became transnational from day one. That is, capitalism is an international, global, transnational system from the beginning. This is not something that happened later, like Lenin would say. So I always say that Lenin came to correct conclusion, but he was so Eurocentric that he thought that capitalism moved by stages. First competitive capitalism, and then moved to monopoly capitalism. Well, that's true if you look at it from inside Europe. But if you look at the capitalist world system as a global system, it was never like that. It was always about monopolization of markets and the super exploitation financial capital taking over production and you know, super exploiting labor and so on, you know, and also natural resources. But anyway, I think this has implications, because if you take that definition, then it comes naturally to conclude that our future should not be against markets. Okay, whatever we do into the future to overcome this should not be thinking that we're going to be a market-less world. You see, that's absurd. Okay. Second, we have to conclude also that there will be small entrepreneurs, even some individual capitalists, but they will be controlled by communal forms of political authority. So that could coexist with other forms of production, like communal forms of production, with a collectivist form of production and so on. That could have, you know, and the markets are going to be there as part of the exchange of products, etc. But now, without being controlled by the speculation of financial capital, or being controlled by individual capitalists, or being organized along the logic of profits or greed, but be organized along a different value system that will take care of the community needs, you know, of the people, you know. So that's also something that I think, and that definition I gave of capitalism is also related to our discrepancies about this character of the Soviet Union, because you're using there in your definition why you don't see capitalism there is because you are saying you didn't see competition, you see, or you see state control over markets and so on. And I think that precisely capitalism is about that. It's about monopoly capitalism. It's about you know, monopolization of markets. It's about financial capital leading the whole thing, and therefore, if there's no competition in the Soviet Union, doesn't mean that there's no capitalism. It just means that they are in a monopoly capitalist kind of organization of production. But anyway,
Okay.
we cover a lot.
Yeah. All right. But the question then comes, what could they have done different? What could the leadership of the Bolshevik Party have done different in terms of the economic policies? I think that the problem is maybe they couldn't have done anything different because the situation under which they operated led to the degeneration of the revolution itself, in the sense that once the workers lost power, there were no mechanisms that enabled masses of people to get involved in their own future. Then your economic policy is just a reflection of the fact that you control a population by force and not by consent. So the thing is, the question, what could they have done differently, is something we will maybe discuss next time. Think about it in terms of what lessons can we learn from the Russian Revolution. What is it that is there?
Yeah, I think that we need to go. We haven't gone in detail about that. It's kind of implied. We haven't yet covered that, which is the paradigm under which they were working. I mean, you kind of went at the beginning of this video going over how they thought, what was their vision, no? And you summarize it very well. But I think we need to go into a decolonial critique to their paradigm. Okay. We sort of did that today with the question about markets being evil, and then with envisioning a future without markets and so on. I mean, this is a very problematic idea, and associating markets with capitalism when you have markets since the beginning of humanity without being capitalists. Okay. Anyway, so I think we need to also go into the question of modernity and capitalism. I think we need to discuss that.
Let me add something to it, into the question of civilization. So the whole question of socialism was never related to the question of civilization.
Exactly.
It was always within the Western Enlightenment.
Yes.
And therefore, it saw the Western Enlightenment as the ultimate civilization, with which we realize globally, you see?
Yes.
So if we want to have a decolonial critique of that paradigm, that vision which they created, that is what we should talk about. So let's take it up for the next week.
Yes, because this is where I mean by the discussion of modernity and capitalism. Because modernity is, for me, the civilizational part that is missing in the paradigm they were using. Okay. Anyway, okay.
Right.
See you next week.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.